All right. So Rachel Pierson is a master's student here at UVM, and she's originally from Edgewater, Maryland. And she developed her love for the natural environment and especially for water while boating on tributaries to Chesapeake Bay during summers while she was growing up. She attended Salisbury University, where she received a Bachelor of Arts in Environmental Studies and a Bachelor of Science in Geography. And she also was lucky to be able to study abroad for a semester in Costa Rica. If everyone can mute who is not me or Rachel, that would be helpful. Thanks. So for her research, for her master's degree, she carried it out in partnership with a number of community science groups from across the globe, who you'll hear about from her in a minute. And they were all focused on volunteer stream monitoring. I'm excited to announce that she recently accepted an AmeriCorps position as the volunteer coordinator for the Environmental Literacy and Outdoor Education Office programs at Arlington Echo Outdoor Education Center in Millersville, Maryland, where is back to home. And one of the things that Rachel said, she enjoys hiking, baking, backyard gardening, relaxing with a good book in her hammock, and she's happiest when she's near the water with family and friends. So coming into that with the water focus, I'm going to turn it over to Rachel. Again, if everyone can make sure that they're muted, that would be great and helpful. We will have questions at the end for Rachel, and then following the question period for the public, we'll have everyone leave except for her committee and her, and move on from there in her defense. So thanks for being here this morning, and I'll turn it over to Rachel.
Awesome. Thank you for that introduction, Chris. Thanks to you all for being here this morning. I wish we could be in person in Aiken like normal, you know, being in the room together, but it's just as awesome to see so many friendly faces here virtually today. So thanks for being here with me, for listening to my research and the culmination of this as we come together today. So I'm going to share my screen to share my presentation, and then Chris, if you don't mind just giving me a thumbs up or something just to make sure that it works, that would be awesome.
Okay. Yep, we can see it.
Okay, you can see me and you can hear me too?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. All right, then without further ado, thank you for being here today. So I'm very excited to share with you all my master's research and the work that I've done, as Chris mentioned, with volunteer stream monitoring groups across the globe. So I'll be sharing with you a piece of the research today focused on the role of place attachment in volunteer motivations and why these people are getting involved in community science. So before I begin, I just want to start with an overview of where this presentation is headed so you have an idea of what to expect. So my thesis had 2 chapters. The first chapter was a comprehensive literature review. So I'll start with that. I'll share with you some background on community science, concepts of place, as well as the context of place attachment in volunteer monitoring as we know of it today. Then I'll move into what was my second chapter, which was this international project on stream monitoring groups. I worked with stream monitoring groups in the United States, Canada, and New Zealand. And so this was a collaborative project looking at essentially what motivates people to volunteer for these programs. So I'll share my research questions, methods, touch on some of the results, a bit of and conclusions. So to begin, I want to show you this word cloud that actually was created by Chris. What you're looking at right now is several of the different terms that are used to describe what is most commonly known as citizen science. You see that as the largest phrase right there in the center of your screen. Citizen science is getting the general public involved in scientific research. And all of these phrases that you're looking at are different ways to describe citizen science. Essentially, they all mean the same thing. Public participation in scientific research, you see that at the top of your screen. And what I usually use is volunteer monitoring, though there has been some discussion recently to move away from using the phrase citizen science because it's not as inclusive because of the use of that word citizen. So I prefer to use the term community science instead. I feel it's more inclusive and accurate. It better describes the idea of getting the community and the public involved in scientific research, people who are not necessarily trained scientists. So you'll hear me use both volunteer monitoring and community science moving forward. Just know that they basically mean the same thing. So what are the types of community science? Well, the list that you see on the left of your screen are the types of community science that are more traditional, in that they're the types of programs that kind of began with the initiation of community science. Those in ecology, biology, bird watching, looking at insects, folks who are engaged in wildlife and land management, water and air quality. So we see several community science programs related to these topics. However, recently, due to the longitudinal scope of community science, if you have volunteers involved over large geographic areas, you can really gather quite a bit of data. And so this longitudinal aspect of community science has opened up opportunities in things such as astrology and health professions, even online gaming and computing programs, especially in today's digital age. If you're able to give people, let's say, a screenshot, a photo of a galaxy, taken by a NASA satellite, you can have volunteers from across the globe looking at that same photo because it's digital. So in recent years, this field has really just expanded because of the nature of community science and being able to get lots of people involved from lots of different areas. So there's a lot of potential here from the perspective of data collection. Now today I'll be talking with you about volunteer monitoring. So specifically volunteer monitoring, in the context I'll be referring to it, is monitoring conditions of local streams, lakes, estuaries, wetlands, and groundwater resources by trained volunteers. Again, these people are volunteers, they're not being paid, but they are trained in some capacity. So volunteer monitoring, in the sense I am using the term, refers to water resources more generally. And you see in this photo here some volunteers who are taking a stream width measurement. The person in the center is holding a D-net, which you use to collect benthic macroinvertebrates in the stream, all ways of measuring stream health. So before I begin, I thought I would share with you some of the things that volunteer monitors do for those of you who may not be as familiar with this. So the left picture you're looking at right now is a picture I took while I was sampling with some volunteer stream monitors in New Zealand. And it shows various chemical tests that folks will do, measuring nitrates in the water, phosphates, pH, even temperature. In the center, again, is that same D-net to collect benthic macroinvertebrates, other little critters that are living in the stream. And on the right, that's a photo of a volunteer using a small vial to collect a water sample to send off to a lab for analysis. Now, people involved in volunteer monitoring do other things as well. The top right corner of your screen, you see some of those benthic macroinvertebrates that some students I was working with collected. You'll see a snippet of an ID identification sheet. These people going through and figuring out which of these benthic macroinvertebrates live in the stream. In the bottom left corner, these two volunteers are engaged in restoration efforts. So they're not necessarily in the stream taking water quality measurements such as clarity or nitrates and phosphates. They're actually along the stream bank, and they plant native grasses and trees to help with runoff into the stream. And so this is another way people can get involved in stream monitoring. There are also other folks, not shown in any of these pictures, but who will walk alongside the stream and pick up trash. So that's another way of becoming involved in volunteer monitoring, things that are related to the health of the stream. In the center, that's a photo of me using a turbidity tube in New Zealand, measuring water clarity, how clear the water is. And in some cases, people even wade into the stream with waders that you see at the bottom. So just a brief snippet of some of the things that these people do. So I want to give a brief background on the groups that I was working with. So this map that you're looking at shows over 280 different volunteer water monitoring programs across the United States. Now, some of these programs are umbrella organizations who have smaller subsets of volunteer monitoring groups within them. So there's about 1,700 total volunteer water monitoring programs across the entire United States. And many of these programs came to fruition in the 1960s and the 1970s with the beginning of the environmental era. And people wanting to get more involved with protecting their local environments. We also saw increased funding for universities and colleges and funding coming from the government to engage in data collection and research about, in this case, the health of our national waterways. So a lot of these programs are often either supported by the government or university, even sometimes nonprofits. So they have structural support from those entities, but they also often have financial support as well. So just to keep that in mind moving forward. In Canada, we saw about the same sort of beginning of these groups, again, about the 1960s, 1970s, with that same environmental era. And originally, these groups were supported by regional governments, local authorities, some colleges and universities, the same, similar to the United States as far as funding is concerned. However, recently, many of these groups in Canada are no longer as supported by regional government and universities. So a lot of these groups are grassroots organized. And so in Canada, we have just over 200 community-based monitoring groups. That's one of those phrases from the word cloud. Basically means the same thing, just the terminology used in Canada. They're community-based, grassroots organized. And in New Zealand, these groups are much younger. Starting just before 2000, these groups started forming in New Zealand. As a whole, the country has over 600 community environmental groups, I think environmental broadly, but 130 of these groups are what are called Y Care groups. The word Y is an Indigenous Maori term for water. So these are those water care groups, water monitoring groups, if you will. So there's about 130 of them in New Zealand. And they're frequently supported by their regional governments, some collaboration with universities as well. So these water monitoring groups are those that I was working with for this study. Now, what are some of the reasons people get involved in community science? Well, we see that motivations are either extrinsic or intrinsic. Extrinsic related to some external factor, such as benefiting one's career. Intrinsic being those that are internally motivating, someone who wants to just learn more or hold some sort of personal value. They feel responsible personally for getting involved in volunteering in some way. Excuse me. Some of the broader categories of motivation we see in community science include things that are nature-based, recreation, just getting outside in nature, personal values, personal growth, that's that learning piece, interacting with other people, being social, meeting new people, doing something with family or friends, also the structure of the project, how it's organized, and finally, a connection to a particular place. Now, the top two most common specific motivational factors for becoming involved in community science has been observed to be helping the environment and learning. So people want to get involved for these altruistic reasons of helping the earth, but also learning for their own personal growth. I'd also like to point out this connection to place. This is, if you will, what motivated me to take on this study is a real interest in how are people, what are people's relationships with the place where they live, or does it inform why they decide to get involved in community science, and what can we learn from that? Also of interest is the difference between initial versus long-term motivations. I've adopted this from a study of initial and long-term motivations, and we see that the reason people initially become involved is often different than the reason they continue participating in these programs. And this holds great value as far as recruiting and retaining volunteers. So those factors affecting initial participation are generally more self-related, self-promotion, self-efficacy, a feeling of being responsible to take on this activity. But then those that are contributing to long-term participation are things such as, trusting other group members, having common goals and common values to those people in your community, also being acknowledged for the work that you're doing as a volunteer, and then building networks and relationships with people outside of your monitoring group, such as in the community. So these are some of the differences that we see, and again, helps us to understand why people get involved and what keeps them going. So you've heard me say this a few times. I thought it would be helpful to define what place attachment is for those of you who may not know. Essentially, place attachment is a bond between a person and a place. It's an affective bond, meaning that it is emotional. So I'd like you to think of a place that's special to you, that holds some sort of significance. It doesn't have to be outside necessarily. It could be your home. It could be a home you had 10 years ago. It could be the library that you go to and you read a book sitting there, once every week or something like that. It probably means that you have an attachment to that place if it holds some sort of special significance to you. For me, as Chris mentioned, that place, to me, I have particular places on the Chesapeake Bay that really hold significance for me. I would like to briefly distinguish this from sense of place. Sense of place really is more abstract and subjective. It has to do with emotional and psychological feelings about a place. So really, sense of place is experiences that are associated with a particular place that kind of informs how one feels about the place. But it doesn't necessarily mean someone is attached to that place. So place attachment can really be defined or measured by these two psychometric measures, place identity and place dependence. Place identity, if you think about the word identity, it's much more personal. So it's an emotional attachment, has to do with the symbolic importance of a place that serves as a center of emotional meaning and relationship. It gives meaning to one's life, if you will. You identify with that place. It's much more emotional. Place dependence, on the other hand, is a functional attachment. That's reflective of the use of that place, its function in your life. Function can be some sort of activity you do there, whether it's recreationally, maybe you use the place to go kayaking, but it can also be a function of a life necessity, people who depend on a place for some sort of feature it provides. Maybe it's your water source, something of that nature. So these two items, I used measures of place identity and place dependence in my survey to get at this idea of place attachment and whether or not these two psychometric measures can be used within questions about what motivates people to get involved as a way to measure if place attachment serves as a motivation. So what you're looking at here is a brief list of some of the literature that touches on concepts of place, those are related to place attachment, that have informed people's motives to get involved in community science. Now, this includes a sense of place and development of an ecological identity. Again, that identity word coming up. Place meanings and memories as motivations for getting involved, holding specific meanings and memories as significant, as well as just a general attachment to the environment, but also that attachment that is forming from visiting said place. These are all, related to place attachment and reasons why people may get involved in volunteer monitoring. And here we have also seen concepts of place, connections to place as outcomes of participating in these programs. So sense of place and place attachment have been seen to be an outcome of getting involved in community science. So folks get involved for some other reason, and as a result, they're more attached to the place where they monitored, or the place in general where they were working and volunteering. Excuse me. Also, place attachment has strengthened some connections between recreation and pro-environmental behaviors. So as a result of participating, this holding an identity with this particular place has led people to adopt different behaviors. They've changed behaviors or attitudes towards the environment and become more environmentally responsible. So this is of interest as far as garnering support for protecting local natural resources, but also creating a more environmentally engaged community. So this leads into my second chapter. This is kind of the foundation of what motivated this research study is how exactly does place attachment fit in these other categories of motivation that have been observed: personal values, personal growth, project organization. We see that connection to place coming up, but what about place attachment specifically? Are people attached to an area and that's why they decide to join a monitoring group, or do they become more attached as a result? And what does that mean in the era of great environmental change and trying to protect these resources that we have? So the specific research questions that we asked were: does place attachment influence people's decision to initially volunteer? And also, does the level of attachment differ between those new and experienced volunteers? Do motivations change over time? And is there variance in the top motivation among countries? There's limited literature that compares motivations between countries, and so that was an avenue to explore that and see what we can learn from potentially from each other across the globe. So these top two research questions are those I'll really focus on today, but we'll touch on the third and fourth as well. So the study sites. In the United States, I worked with groups who are part of the Alliance for Aquatic Resource Monitoring. Shown in the map, in those generally, the areas of those groups are shown by those yellow circles that you see. All of these groups were within the Chesapeake Bay watershed, shown by that red boundary there. In Canada, I worked with groups who were part of the Columbia Basin Watershed Network that is now the newly formed Columbia Basin Monitoring Collaborative and Associated Data Hub. These groups were located within the Columbia River watershed, the portion that is in Canada. So as you see on the map, the watershed is shown by that yellow globular shape. It does cross the boundary between the US and Canada, but just to be clear, the groups were only located in British Columbia. And finally, we also worked with groups in New Zealand who participated with the Stream Health Monitoring and Assessment Kit program. This is a program that came out of their National Institute for Water and Atmospheric Research and supported by NEWA. These groups were located in both the North and South Island. You'll see shown on the map with those red circles. So what do we do to collect this data about volunteers? Well, we administered an online survey in the summer of 2019. It was sent via email to all of the volunteers who participate with each of these groups. The survey was open for 4 weeks and asked questions about people's monitoring site, how they feel about their site, how close the site is to their home, how long they've lived in an area, how long they spend at the site collecting their data, what they do with the data after they collect it. And then also, of course, those questions about people's motivations. Why did they get involved? And then what sorts of actions did they take as a result of their participation? After administering the survey, I followed up with either in-person interviews or interviews done via video conference or phone call with a subset of people who took the survey. They were randomly selected and anonymously and asked to participate in an interview if they wished. So this is where I was afforded, very fortunately, to travel to meet with some of these people. So as a result, the results, starting with the survey, about 230 total volunteers were sent the survey. You'll see the breakdown in each place below there. And from that 230 people, 101 total volunteers completed or partially completed the survey. This is about 44% overall response rate, which we were pretty happy with. So as I mentioned, I followed up with interviews with 25 total volunteers. We had 9 interviews in the US, 6 in Canada, and 9 in New Zealand. This photo that you're looking at is a photo of me in New Zealand with a particular monitoring group. My research collaborator, Dr. Amanda Wawa, is on the left. Volunteer is in the middle, and then someone from an outside monitoring group who assists with this program also came to join us. So we're at one of their sampling sites in this photo. So of interest to us first was to see who was a new volunteer and who was an experienced volunteer. And we actually saw about a 50-50 split in our total in the total responses from the survey. So we defined new volunteers prior to sending out the survey as those folks who began in 2018 or 2019. Keep in mind this survey was administered last summer, so that means they were involved for about a year and a half or so. And then those volunteers who were experienced began in 2018 or earlier, going all the way back to 1980. And we actually did have one volunteer who had been involved since 1980 and a few since the mid-80s as well. So we had people who were involved from 1980 all the way up to 2019, which was pretty neat to have that range of experience. So most people monitored only one site, though a few did monitor more than one. And even some, about 11% of volunteers monitored 5 or more sites. But roughly about 57% you're seeing there only monitor one site. And the majority of people also live rather close to their site, anywhere from less than 1 kilometer to up to 5 kilometers. The majority of volunteers live quite close. And this may be due to the fact that they're getting involved with a local community group, and so their stream is near them. Some people told me that their stream is right in their backyard, and that's why they chose to get involved, because it ran through their property. But also, it's interesting to note just that some people travel farther than 30 kilometers to get to their monitoring site. So these are really dedicated volunteers who do really care about the work that they're doing and are willing to travel to these places. So we also looked into the motivations of new versus experienced volunteers, again, getting at that idea behind recruiting and retaining people. And we saw that those new volunteers were most interested in helping to protect or restore aquatic ecosystems, whereas those experienced volunteers were more concerned about fish and or other aquatic life. We could speculate here on potential differences. perhaps experienced volunteers have learned a bit more about the water quality specifically. Now they know what lives in the stream, so they're concerned about those sorts of things. Potentially new volunteers, again, more altruistic, wanting to just help the environment and get involved in some way. So just possible reasons for these differences. We also looked at the top motivation by country. So on the survey, I asked volunteers to rank their top 3 motivations for participating. And then we broke these down by country to see how these top motivations compare in different places. In the US, we saw that most people were concerned about water quality issues, whereas in Canada, most people said that they were most interested to help protect or restore aquatic ecosystems. And then again, in New Zealand, they're concerned about water quality issues. So some similarity here, but also that difference with those folks in Canada. Now this table shows those top three motivations split by country. This top line you're looking at here is the same as the previous slide. I just included it for consistency. Now what's interesting is this second ranked motivation. What you'll notice is that those top 1 and 2 just flipped in each place. And so I think this really speaks to the idea that people even across the globe who are getting involved in water resource monitoring become involved for much the same reasons. Now there is some discussion about this idea of a rural versus urban dichotomy in the sense that potentially stream characteristics might come into play. Let's say, for example, in the US, a stream is more urban, then potentially that maybe there's some more concern there for water quality because of pollution from development or something to that end. Someone in New Zealand had also shared that there was a land use change. There was some logging that began near their stream, and that's why they wanted to get involved. They're concerned about the water quality. Perhaps in Canada, folks recognize, out in British Columbia that they live in a more rural environment and they have very pristine streams, and they want to protect them and keep them that way. So it's interesting to think about maybe some of the, excuse me, differences underlying these motivations and why that might be. And then you'll also see the third motivation does differ in all of these places. I think this speaks to the idea of functional analysis, in that we know that people volunteer for the same thing for different reasons because people are different. And so most people in the US interested in getting involved in scientific research. New Zealand, there are 3 listed there. That's because those 3 tied as the third motivation, third ranked motivation. So getting outside in nature, again, that participating in scientific research, and then people in Canada wanting to learn some more about their local resources. So here I'd like to just briefly share a snippet of who these volunteers are. So some demographics. You're looking at age, gender, level of education, and race and ethnic group. So what I would like to point out here and draw your attention to are these yellow boxes. What we see, if you look first at the top of your screen for age, most of the volunteers who participated in this study were older. This is pretty common across community science groups. Those folks who belong to the retired population, they have a bit more time on their hands to volunteer. We also see under level of education. Now, these are split up by country simply for the reason that each place asks about level of education in a different way. And so I thought it was beneficial to keep them in the manner in which these countries ask folks these questions. And the same goes for race and ethnic group, again, kept in the same phrasing that these places use for their to ask these sorts of questions. So across the board, most volunteers are well educated. They hold some sort of advanced degree. Again, pretty common in community science groups. And as far as race and ethnicity, In the United States, almost all volunteers did identify as white, and in Canada, most volunteers reported that the ethnic group to which they felt they belonged to was that they identified as Canadian, and in New Zealand, most people identified as New Zealand European. Again, just speaking to the idea that it would there is a need to increase diversity in community science, and while this isn't something we necessarily touched on here, just to give you an idea of who these people are and an area for more research, really. So as I mentioned, we asked people why they got involved in these programs. On a scale of strongly agree to strongly disagree with each of these statements listed here, there's 16. Things getting at more of, the water resources, specifically learning about water resources, restoring aquatic ecosystems, concern about fish and aquatic life, also concern about water quantity and flows, as well as water quality. We also asked questions that were related more towards social interactions, meeting new people, doing things with family and friends, also recreation, just getting outside, those that are nature-based, doing things that people enjoy, learning new skills and knowledge, participating in scientific research, as well as those that got at the idea of place attachment, as I mentioned, place identity and place dependence. So that would be identifying strongly with a place, monitoring that this particular place is more important to them than any other place. They find that their life is organized around this place. Those are the sorts of questions that get at place attachment. My reason for showing you this is that we ran a factor analysis on a principal component analysis, on these motivations to see how they group. It's essentially a data reduction technique. And so it takes this big list of motivations and separates them into smaller groups of those items that they load together. They belong together, if you will, and forms clusters of larger motivation categories. So here, this is a simplified version of the factor analysis. We saw 4 larger categories of motivation shown in blue: concern for water resource, place attachment, learning and engagement, and direct involvement in science. What I'd like to draw your attention to are these first 2 components. In that, when you direct your attention to the right side of your screen, that top component, concern for water resource, explains 28.4% of the variance in these, the total variance in these motivations. Whereas the second component, place attachment, explains 14.7% of the total variance in these motivations. And so really these top 2 components are explaining 43% cumulatively of the variance that we see. And I think it just also speaks to the idea that place attachment does hold some value as a motivation. We also looked at this difference between new and experienced volunteers. Here you're seeing the percentage of new volunteers and experienced volunteers who either strongly agreed or agreed with these statements. So they answered positively as to these statements being a motivation for their participation. And what I'd like to point out here is that we did see a statistical significance in some of these statements. And particularly the last statement is interesting. I wanted to participate in a project with my family or friends is not something we normally see to be a part of place attachment scales. And so I think this has potential for further analysis of, are people becoming attached to a place? Did it load with this grouping because people become more attached because of social interactions, getting at that idea of place as a social construction, really. So I'm taking a bit of a different turn with the discussion. I thought I would share some quotes with you all from the interviews that I did, having a chance to talk with some of these volunteers. So I'm beginning with a quote from an experienced volunteer in Canada who said, "The site that's in the forest, in my little spiritual place, is very special to me because it does feel like I'm going to the cathedral to commune with nature." I pulled this quote because I think it really speaks to this idea of place attachment. They use terms of, affection. This place is special to them. it's very personal. And so I thought this was just a great way to kind of share with you all some of the way people talked about these places where they monitored. Now, we also had volunteers. These are both from New Zealand, one new and one experienced. The new volunteer just speaks to the idea of the condition of their water is pristine. They know that they're fortunate that they have clean water all in all. So for this particular person, it was important to improve on that if they could, but also just to maintain what they have and not let it go backwards for those future generations of people. So recognizing that they have good water quality and wanting to keep it that way. Now, this volunteer on the right, they speak to something that came up in several of the interviews of people who had experience already in water monitoring in some capacity, generally their career, whether it's they were an ecologist or a meteorologist, hydrologist. And so they felt that their knowledge they could really share with others, and getting involved in water monitoring was something they could contribute significantly to. And this person also spoke of the forestry operations that concerned them as far as the water quality in their tributary and why they got involved, coming from more of a data science perspective. Now, these two volunteers, the top quote you're looking at, this person also talks about their background in microbiology, virology, and saying they've always had an interest in animals and nature and plants. And I really like the end of this. They say, so I have a personal connection with that. And I like water. I'm like a dog. I see water and I have to jump in, and I'm still that way. Just speaking to that personal interest. These people are passionate about these topics and want to get involved with them. And the person on the bottom, again, just reflecting that idea of they recognized there was a need to collect this data in that particular part of Canada where they live. And you know, the benefit of collecting this data over the long term and having that longitudinal data set to compare. This volunteer speaks to that rural versus urban dichotomy I mentioned. They say they previously lived in an urban place, moved to a rural environment, and they really just say their reasons of being committed is their awareness that in the part of the world where they live, they have many beautiful and unique things, but they won't stay that way unless people take an active role to do something about it. And so they go on to say you become aware that you really are responsible for the environment. And if you don't notice and do things about what's going on, nobody else will, and your environment will change and degenerate as a consequence. Just getting to the idea of, especially some of these groups that are grassroots organized, people really just wanting to get involved intrinsically and do something to help the area where they live. This experienced volunteer from the US, again, just spoke to the idea that they saw through a study that the stream was high in nitrates and phosphates. And so the end, they say they want to bring public attention to it and start educating. This gets at the idea of social diffusion, which is just knowledge sharing. And potentially a benefit of community science that people will start sharing what they're learning with other folks in the community and bringing attention to some of these issues and the work that they're doing. This person reflected this idea of place attachment and volunteer monitoring being very emotional. They say they got involved because they really cared deeply about the natural world and want to make it okay for you guys being future generations. They did get very emotional and apologized and said, you know, it's supposed to be healing, but it's personal. Monitoring is personal. It's altruistic on some level, but it's really personal. Just getting at that idea of these emotional attachments. And this last quote, this person, I think, brought everything together. They said they get quite a lot of joy from going to the sites. They feel an ownership, a responsibility, a pride, again, getting at that idea of attachment. And they feel a concern that they have a system they don't want a system that's full of chlorine, right now the water is beautiful and pure, clean and tasty. It tastes like water, and so they feel pure happy that they get to live in a place where you can still do that, still drink from water from a creek, and it makes them protective to keep it that way. Now, I know from talking to this person, their stream was their drinking water source, completely unfiltered. And so I think this also just goes to speak to the idea that these people sometimes depend on these resources, and they want to do whatever they can to protect them. So moving into some conclusions, just to wrap things up. Really, as I've shared with you all today, place attachment is an important motivation for participating in volunteer stream monitoring programs. Some of the experienced volunteers that I spoke with mentioned that the reason they got involved, while it included several things, it was related to being attached to the place, either where they live, to the stream, they grew up going there as a kid, but also many of them did share with me that their attachment strengthened over time. So we're even seeing that in some cases, if people are already attached to a place, that attachment is becoming stronger as a result of participating in these programs. And so what I would like to leave you with is that place attachment has potential to hold value in the context of garnering support for protection of local resources. If these residents care about a place, they may be more inclined to protect that place. And as I mentioned before, under the guise of environmental change, really program managers can potentially focus outreach. They can consider focusing outreach on identifying potential volunteers with existing person-place bonds. Are there people out there who already really care about this particular stream, let's say, but also nurturing connections to place with existing volunteers and hopefully beginning to create a more environmentally conscious community, especially as we move forward, in this age. So just to wrap up, thank you all for listening today. Thanks for your support. Thank you to my thesis committee, Dr. Christine Stepanek, Dr. Patricia Stokowski, and Dr. Jane Kolodinsky for your dedication, for your time and effort and support. Thank you to my project collaborators across the globe, Julie Vastine, Dr. Amanda Valois, Kat Hartwig, and Kristen Asen for your involvement and for taking this on with us. Thank you to the West Lab, the Rubenstein School, all of the monitoring groups who were involved, especially the volunteers who participated in this research. And of course, thanks to my family and friends for your support. So with that, I think I'm right on the button, right at 45 minutes. So I'll open it up for questions and stop sharing my screen so we can get started.
Thanks, Rachel. So folks can feel free to unmute yourselves to ask questions, or you can put things in the chat and we can translate them that way.
Hi, Rachel. This is Holden. First of all, good job.
Thank you.
Hard to get the applause across the screen, but good job. I did have a question about the demographics. I'm curious if the demographics that you found, there were any differences between the new volunteers or the established volunteers, or if the demographics you found were representative of the populations for the areas that you were surveying as well.
That's a good question. I can't exactly speak to the new versus experienced volunteers, though that is something that we could certainly consider looking into. I was looking more generally at all of those volunteers together. And then I would say, as far as my experience with the groups and what I do know about volunteer monitoring in each of these places, the demographics we found do seem to be consistent with those of the locations where we were working, but also, as I mentioned, with community science more generally. Yeah. Anybody else? I think a few things are popping in the chat. Let me just make sure.
Lots of kudos.
Oh, yeah.
And I think that your committee will wait till your defense to probably ask questions. So if
Sure.
others, there's an opportunity for anyone who's not part of Rachel's committee to ask questions. Thanks, Holden, for asking.
I have one more, but I can let somebody else go first if other people have questions.
I think go for it.
Okay. So on your last slide, you had, I was kind of wondering the whole time about like the future implications of this, right? And you spoke to it a little bit in your last slide. I think I'm really curious about how, how these findings can be used. Like if someone is, wanted to start up a new volunteer group, how those kind of motivations and everything could be used to inform that outreach. And I was just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit more, or maybe examples you've seen of groups that have used these techniques and, how that has worked out.
Sure, absolutely. So I think the first thing that I'll start with from talking with people and also that came out of some of their responses in the survey is really this desire for some folks to get involved, and as I mentioned, seeing a need in their local community out of concern for, in this case, a particular stream. A lot of the groups, particularly in Canada and New Zealand, were grassroots organized, and in some cases were community members who had some sort of background in water monitoring who created the group themselves. So rather than what we generally have seen in the US of groups coming through universities and being supported in that way, there is potential that there's people who were part of the local community who really want to get involved and in some cases weren't sure how to do so, and so they created their own groups. So I think that's related to the idea of place attachment and people being motivated by place, a potential resource that program managers could consider trying to tap into of, are there people who are already in this area who want to do something like this and just don't know that there is a program out there, or who would be interested in creating a program? So I think I would start by saying that. And then as far as recruiting and retaining volunteers, a lot of folks, as far as people coming back year after year, I think it is important for them to see where their data is going. I think that is a barrier to participating, in that if people aren't really sure where all this data they're collecting, how it's being used, if this is something that was shared with me as well, if they don't know where it's going or they don't feel that it's being used, I would say attrition rates really start to go up, because what's the motivation there if they're doing this and they don't know why? So I think that's important to keep in mind for program managers as well, is that it can be easy to say, well, yes, if these people enjoy it, they'll keep coming back. But I think that feedback is more important than perhaps is maybe recognized in some cases.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, Rach. Great job on your presentation. I really loved it. So you mentioned at the beginning that your research was something that was sort of new looking between different countries. And I was wondering if you had any speculations about if you had looked at maybe other countries that have more cultural differences, because I feel like the United States and Canada and New Zealand have more similar cultures, but like looking at, maybe somewhere in Asia or in the Middle East or something.
Yes, that's a really great point. And I think in the research that I have read of folks who have compared motivations in other countries, they have focused more on the cultural differences between these places. We didn't focus on that as much in this particular research and getting into cultural differences, but I think that's certainly an area definitely for future research and something that would be worth looking into. I would say that, to your point, the idea that the places that were included in this research are potentially culturally more similar may have to do with the fact that their motivations overall were more similar. That was just how we framed this study and with the collaborators that participated. But I would say that from what I have read, I do think that, let's say, someone did do a study in over in India, sorry, stumbled over that word, and found that people weren't necessarily attached to a stream or a place in the same way that I kind of framed it today, being more emotional, but rather it was more functional, and these people depended on that river for their water and for cooking food and bathing, and whereas they weren't maybe as place attached from a Western perspective, they really depended on that stream because of what it provided for their livelihood. So I think when looking at place attachment but motivation more specifically, those people were motivated to protect the stream because of its importance to their life. So I definitely think that there are cultural differences there, and potentially quite important ones, especially for creating support for some of these programs. Yeah. So thanks for that question. Yeah, that's a really
great. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Hi, Ray. So we have time for one more if somebody has one, and then we will. Sounded like somebody started to ask one.
Yeah, if there's time, I'll ask one. Well, first of all, congrats, Rachel. That was awesome.
Thank you.
And I many things stood out to me, and I found really interesting, like the difference between sense of place and place attachment. I thought that is really interesting. Mm-hmm. And also just like how heavily important it is to have that place of attachment to motivate volunteers. Mm-hmm. And so thinking about similar to a previous question, like the lack of diversity, mm-hmm. of racial and ethnic diversity, especially it stood out to me here in the US. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you have any thoughts about the link of that importance of place of attachment to motivate groups or individuals, and what types of, based on your experience or some of the readings or something for the literature review, if you found any links between trying to motivate different groups to diversify volunteers and community involvement in different racial and ethnic groups, and how to get at those groups and their place of attachment.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks for that question, Nati. I think that you bring up a really great point, and that's certainly a conversation occurring in the community science community now, is how do we diversify our programs, and how do you recruit a more well-rounded group of volunteers? So it is a challenge because one of the barriers to participating in community science and volunteer monitoring is that it's volunteer. It is on your own time. There's no compensation as a volunteer monetarily. And so from what I have read, more underprivileged populations may be more affected by that sort of barrier because they have to focus on other things like taking care of a family or working. They can't necessarily take off work to volunteer. And so this is something that I've been thinking about in doing this research and realizing that a lot of these folks are more well-educated and are more affluent. We didn't ask that question, but a lot of people are more well off. And so for me, thinking about how to create more diverse groups. I think one of the things I read was changing recruitment strategies. And rather than using the usual newsletter or social media, even doing something like just walking around communities and putting flyers at every third door. And also maybe bringing events to communities. You know, if you know the demographics of the community where you live or work, if you're a manager, a program manager, then potentially, if the resources exist to bring a program to that community, I think could help to get at that sort of gap and that need, really, to be able to get more diversity in these community groups. So I think that could be a place to start, is if the resources exist, and also creating opportunities for that to happen, to bring these opportunities to people who might otherwise not be able to become involved.
Thanks for the question, Natalia.
Thanks.
So thanks, everybody. I think we'll close this part of the defense at this point. So thanks to everybody who joined this to hear Rachel's presentation and asking great questions, and lots of kudos if you didn't see them yet in the chat, Rachel. And at this point, we'll ask everybody but our committee and Rachel to head off and do whatever else is coming next on your schedules. And we'll take 10 minutes and meet back to go through your defense.
Okay. Thank you, everyone.
And I'm going to stop recording.